Marshal Thomas Whitmore pulled his coat tighter as the first drops of October rain struck his shoulders. His horse's hooves splashed through the muddy track that wound between dying tobacco fields, each step carrying him deeper into the hollow where the Virginia inn squatted like a diseased growth against the Kentucky mountainside. The smell hit him first, sweet decay masked by something floral, as if someone had scattered rose petals over a charnel house. The inn's windows glowed amber in the gathering dusk, too many candles burning for such a remote establishment. Thomas had ridden 3 days following reports of missing merchants, vanished families, and travelers who'd simply dissolved into the mountain mist. The local sheriff in Harlan County had mentioned the inn with obvious reluctance, crossing himself when he spoke its name. "Federal marshal coming through," Thomas announced as he dismounted, his boots squelching in the mud. The front porch stretched wider than seemed possible, supported by columns carved with intricate spirals that hurt to look at directly. Before he could knock, the door swung open. "Marshal Whitmore, I presume?" The man who greeted him stood tall and lean, his face bearing the kind of symmetrical handsomeness that suggested good breeding. Dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, and his smile revealed teeth too white and too perfect. "Silas Blackwood, proprietor of the Vicrginia Inn. We've been expecting you." Thomas frowned. He'd told no one of his exact destination, traveling under the pretense of a routine survey of mountain establishments. "Have you now?" "Word travels fast in these hills," Silas replied, stepping aside with a sweeping gesture. "Please, come out of that wretched rain. You must be half frozen." The warmth that enveloped Thomas as he stepped inside felt almost liquid, thick with the scent of burning wax and something underneath, something organic and cloying. The main room stretched before him, furnished with heavy wooden tables and chairs that gleamed as if constantly polished. Candles flickered from every surface, their flames dancing without any apparent breeze. "Quite a collection," Thomas observed, nodding toward the portraits that lined the walls. Men and women in formal dress stared down with expressions that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. Their eyes held a peculiar intensity, as if they were studying him with the same attention he paid to them. "Family and honored guests," Silas explained, moving behind a mahogany bar that dominated the room's far wall. "Many have found our hospitality so exceptional they never wished to leave." He poured amber liquid into a crystal glass. "Bourbon. Made it myself from corn grown in our very own fields." A sound drifted from somewhere above, a woman's voice, muffled but unmistakably distressed. It rose and fell in a rhythm that made Thomas's skin crawl, neither quite sobbing nor singing. "You have other guests?" Thomas asked, declining the offered drink. Silas's smile never wavered. "Oh yes, the inn rarely sits empty. We cater to travelers with particular needs. Merchants seeking relaxation after long journeys, ministers requiring spiritual renewal, families in search of healing." The crying continued, joined now by what might have been laughter or perhaps another voice entirely. "The mountains work strangely on people, Marshal. They arrive seeking one thing and discover they need something else entirely." Thomas studied his host's face, searching for any hint of deception. Silas Blackwood appeared the picture of frontier hospitality, well-dressed, articulate, genuinely pleased to welcome a guest. Yet something in his manner suggested performance, as if he were playing a role rehearsed to perfection. "I'll need a room for the night," Thomas said. "Nothing fancy. I'm tracking several missing persons, and this establishment was mentioned as their last known stop." "Ah, the burdens of law enforcement," Silas murmured sympathetically. "Always chasing shadows, aren't you? People disappear in these mountains for any number of reasons, bandits, bears, simple misadventure. But you're most welcome to investigate to your heart's content." He produced a brass key from beneath the bar. "I insist you stay in our finest accommodation. Room 17, specially reserved for distinguished visitors." The key felt heavier than it should, its metal warm against Thomas's palm. The number 17 had been etched deep into the brass, the numerals worn smooth by countless fingers. "That's generous, but unnecessary," Thomas began. "Nonsense." Silas moved from behind the bar with fluid grace, his movements too smooth, too calculated. "Follow me, if you please." They walked through an archway into a corridor that stretched impossibly long. Thomas had observed the inn from outside, a substantial building, but not large enough to accommodate the hallway now extending before them. Doors lined both walls, each bearing only a number carved into the dark wood. The candles here burned lower, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. 17 is just ahead, Silas said, his voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. The previous occupant found it most conducive to deep rest. Previous occupant? A traveling preacher from Virginia. Reverend Matthews, I believe. He'd been suffering from terrible nightmares, poor man. Claimed demons visited him nightly. Silas chuckled softly. We helped him understand that what he took for torment was actually divine revelation. He stayed nearly a month before, moving on. They stopped before a door marked with the number 17. The wood appeared older than the rest, its surface scarred with what looked like claw marks. Thomas ran his fingers along the gouges, feeling their depth. Enthusiastic redecorating by a previous guest, Silas explained smoothly. Artists, you know. They express themselves in the most unusual ways. The key turned easily, revealing a chamber that defied the inn's rustic exterior. Rich carpets covered polished floors, and heavy curtains framed a window that looked out onto the tobacco fields. A four-poster bed dominated the center of the room, its posts carved with the same spiral patterns Thomas had noticed on the porch columns. Supper will be served shortly, Silas announced, backing toward the door. I do hope you'll join us in the dining room. My brother Mordecai is quite the cook, and we have several other guests who'd be delighted to meet a federal marshal. Your brother? My junior partner in this enterprise. You'll find him charming, I'm sure. Silas paused in the doorway, his perfect smile finally showing a crack. A word of advice, Marshal. The mountains play tricks on men's minds, especially at night. Strange sounds, peculiar dreams, they mean nothing. Best to stay in your room until morning. For your own comfort, of course. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Thomas alone with the dancing candlelight and the growing certainty that the Vicrginia inn held secrets far darker than simple robbery or murder. Outside his window, the rain had intensified, drumming against the glass in a rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. From somewhere in the walls around him, he could hear the faint sound of crying again, accompanied now by what might have been whispered prayers or perhaps screams of pleasure, he couldn't tell which. Have you ever walked into a place where every instinct screamed leave, but politeness kept you there? Thomas woke to the sound of laughter echoing through the walls, women's voices, light and musical, though he could swear he'd seen no women the previous evening. Dawn light filtered through his window, revealing the tobacco fields beyond in stark detail. The plants stood in perfect rows, their broad leaves brown with autumn's touch, but something about their arrangement troubled him. The rows were too uniform, too precisely spaced, as if they'd been planted according to some geometric pattern rather than agricultural necessity. He dressed quickly, strapping on his gun belt and badge. The corridor outside his room appeared shorter in daylight, though still longer than the building's exterior dimensions should allow. Most of the numbered doors stood silent, but from behind a few came sounds that made him quicken his pace, soft sobbing, whispered conversations, and underneath it all, a rhythmic creaking like rocking chairs or perhaps bed frames. The main room of the inn sat empty, last night's candles reduced to pools of hardened wax. Thomas pushed through the front door, grateful for the cool mountain air after the oppressive warmth inside. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed and gleaming. Behind the inn, he discovered a garden that hadn't been visible from his window. Wildflowers grew in perfect rows, their blooms unnaturally vibrant despite the season. Purple foxglove, white oleander, and red poppies created a living quilt that stretched across a carefully maintained plot of ground. Thomas began counting the rows, 10, 20, 50, continuing until he reached 87 distinct lines of flowers, each exactly 6 feet in length. At the head of each row stood a small wooden marker, weather-stained but carefully maintained. Thomas knelt beside the nearest one, brushing away accumulated leaves to reveal carved initials, RM, and below them, a date from the previous spring. Beautiful, aren't they? Thomas spun toward the voice, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. A man emerged from the morning mist that clung to the garden's edges, shorter than Silas, broader in the shoulders, but bearing the same aristocratic features. His clothes were caked with fresh soil, and he carried a spade that gleamed despite the early hour. Mordecai Blackwood, the man said, extending a dirt-stained hand. Silas mentioned you'd arrived. Welcome to our little paradise. Thomas stood slowly, noting how Mordecai's eyes never quite met his own, instead focusing somewhere just over his left shoulder. Quite a garden you've cultivated here. Unusual choice of flowers. Each has its purpose, Mordecai replied, running the spade's blade through the earth at his feet. Foxglove for heart troubles, oleander for persistent problems, poppies for those who can't sleep. He gestured toward the rows with obvious pride. Every guest who stays with us long enough gets their own memorial garden. A way of ensuring they're never forgotten. Memorial garden. Mordecai's smile was different from his brother's, less practiced, more genuine, and infinitely more disturbing. We believe pleasure and pain are merely different expressions of the same divine truth, Marshal. Most people fear suffering, but we've learned to help them understand its beauty. Once they do, they never want to leave. Thomas studied the wooden markers, noting dates that spanned the past 3 years. Some bore only initials, others full names carved in careful script. And these marked the graves of your guests. In a manner of speaking. Mordecai leaned on his spade, the morning sun revealing flecks of something dark under his fingernails. Though grave suggests an ending, doesn't it? We prefer to think of these as new beginnings. Each person who finds their way to us discovers something about themselves they never knew existed. A woman's laughter rang out from the inn behind them, quickly followed by what sounded like sobbing. Mordecai's head tilted toward the sound with the attention of a dog hearing its master's whistle. That would be Catherine, he said fondly. She's been with us for 6 months now. When she first arrived, she was terribly unhappy, husband had left her, children wouldn't speak to her. Now she understands that suffering can be its own form of ecstasy. She weeps with joy every morning. Thomas felt ice forming in his chest despite the warming day. I'd like to speak with her. Oh, I'm afraid that's not possible. She's in the middle of her daily devotions. We've found that interrupting the process can cause setbacks. Mordecai turned back to the flower garden, kneeling beside a row of white blooms that seemed to glow in the morning light. Tell me, Marshal, what brings you to our sanctuary? Official business, or are you perhaps seeking something more personal? I'm investigating reports of missing travelers. Several were last seen in this area. Mordecai nodded thoughtfully, using his hands to pat soil around the base of a particularly vibrant poppy. People go missing in the mountains all the time. Bandits, accidents, wild animals. But some discover that what they thought they wanted and what they actually needed are entirely different things. He looked up at Thomas with eyes that seemed older than his face. We provide a service here, you might say. We help people find their true nature. And what nature is that? The part that craves what it fears most. Mordecai stood, brushing dirt from his knees. Take yourself, for instance. You've spent your life bringing order to chaos, hunting criminals, enforcing the law. But underneath all that righteousness, don't you sometimes wonder what it would feel like to simply let go? To stop fighting the darkness and embrace it? Thomas's hand moved to his gun without conscious thought. There was something in Mordecai's voice, a hypnotic quality that made the world seem to blur at the edges. The flower garden appeared to shimmer, and for a moment he could swear he heard voices calling his name from beneath the carefully tended earth. "I think I'll take that breakfast now," Thomas said, stepping back from the garden and the too knowing smile on Mordecai's face. "Of course. Silas will have something prepared." Mordecai turned back to his flowers, humming softly under his breath. "But Marshal, before you leave us, you really should visit our cellar. We keep our finest treasures there, artifacts from guests who've achieved true understanding. I think you'd find them educational." Thomas walked back toward the inn, feeling Mordecai's eyes on his back with every step. The flower garden stretched behind him like a living cemetery, each perfect row marking another soul that had found whatever dark salvation the Blackwood brothers offered. The dining room's atmosphere felt thick enough to choke on. Thomas sat alone at a polished table while Silas prepared breakfast in what must have been an adjoining kitchen, the sounds of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee mixing with the ever-present undertone of muffled voices from upstairs. The portraits lining the walls seemed even more unsettling in daylight, their painted eyes tracking his movements with uncomfortable intensity. A leather-bound ledger sat open on a side table, its pages yellow with age. Thomas glanced toward the kitchen doorway, then moved quickly to examine the book. What he found made his blood run cold. The registry contained far more entries than any remote inn should reasonably host. Names filled page after page in careful script, each accompanied by dates of arrival, notes about preferences, and observations that grew increasingly disturbing the deeper Thomas read. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, arrived June 3, 1845. Widow seeking comfort. Responds well to controlled fear. Essence quality, exceptional. Below that, Reverend Joseph King, arrived August 15, 1845. Guilt-ridden. Enjoys pain when framed as divine punishment. 3-week preparation yielded superior harvest. Thomas flipped through more pages, recognizing names from missing persons reports throughout Kentucky and Virginia. The Caldwell family, parents and 3 children who'd vanished while traveling to their new homestead. Marcus Drum, the tobacco merchant whose disappearance had prompted several investigations. Sarah Mitchell, the young woman who'd left Richmond to visit relatives and never arrived. Most disturbing were the entries that appeared multiple times. Some guests had apparently returned to the inn repeatedly, with notes indicating they became more compliant with each visit. James Morrison, 5th visit. No longer requires restraints. Has achieved perfect submission to enhanced pleasure protocols. Ready for final processing. Finding everything to your satisfaction, Marshal. Thomas spun to find Silas standing in the kitchen doorway, a breakfast tray balanced in his hands. His host's expression remained pleasantly neutral, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. "Interesting guest book," Thomas said, not bothering to conceal what he'd been reading. "Quite detailed records you keep." Silas set the tray on the dining table, eggs, bacon, and coffee that smelled impossibly rich. "We pride ourselves on personalized service. Each guest has unique needs, particular appetites that require careful attention." He moved to close the ledger, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "I'm surprised you could make sense of our notation system. Most people find it quite incomprehensible. I've had experience reading criminal records." Thomas remained standing, his hand resting on his gun. "Some of these names belong to people reported missing across 2 states. Do they?" Silas poured coffee from a silver pot, the liquid steaming in the cool air. "How fascinating. Though I suppose 'missing' is such a relative term, isn't it? Many of our long-term guests simply chose to disconnect from their previous lives. They found something here that made their old existence seem inadequate. A scream echoed from somewhere above them, quickly cut short. Silas didn't even glance toward the ceiling. "That would be Mr. Henderson from room 12, he explained casually, as if commenting on the weather. "He's learning to appreciate new forms of sensation. The initial adjustment can be quite vocal." Thomas drew his weapon, the metal cold against his palm. "I'm placing you under arrest for suspicion of murder and kidnapping." Silas laughed, a sound like crystal bells in a graveyard. "Oh, Marshal, you misunderstand our work entirely. We don't murder anyone. We simply help them discover what they truly desire." He sipped his coffee, seemingly unconcerned by the gun pointed at his chest. "Every person in this inn chose to stay. They could leave whenever they wished, but they don't want to. We've shown them pleasures beyond anything they imagined possible. Through torture. Through revelation." Silas set down his cup, his movements flowing like water. "Tell me, Marshal, have you ever experienced perfect submission? That moment when all resistance falls away and you discover that what you thought was agony is actually ecstasy. We've perfected techniques that blur those lines entirely. Our guests learn to crave their own suffering." The screaming resumed upstairs, but now it carried an unmistakable note of pleasure that made Thomas's skin crawl. Other voices joined it, moaning, weeping, pleading for something that sounded like both mercy and more pain. "You're insane. We're enlightened." Silas moved closer, seemingly oblivious to the weapon trained on him. "Our grandfather discovered certain methods in his travels through the Caribbean. Rituals that teach the mind to reinterpret pain as pleasure, fear as joy. We've refined his work, created a paradise where suffering becomes rapture." Thomas backed toward the front door, keeping his gun level. "The local authorities will be here within days." "Will they?" Silas smiled that perfect, predatory smile. "I wonder, Marshal, what they'll find when they arrive. An inn providing comfort to weary travelers. Guests who speak glowingly of their treatment. We've had sheriffs visit before. They always leave satisfied that we're providing a valuable community service." The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. "You've corrupted local law enforcement. We've shown them the same truths we show everyone." Silas's voice took on an hypnotic quality, the words seeming to echo from multiple directions at once. "The pleasure found in surrendering authority, the joy of serving something greater than oneself. Sheriff Morrison visits us monthly now. He calls it his spiritual retreat." Morrison, Thomas remembered the name from the ledger. The sheriff of Harlan County, the man who'd given him directions to the inn with obvious reluctance. How many others had the Blackwood brothers converted to their twisted philosophy? "I'm leaving," Thomas announced, though his feet seemed reluctant to carry him toward the door. The breakfast Silas had prepared smelled incredible, and the warmth of the inn felt infinitely preferable to the cold mountain air outside. "Of course," Silas agreed readily. "Though I do hope you'll consider our invitation to visit the cellar before you go. We have artifacts down there that would interest a man of your professional background. Evidence of the beautiful work we've accomplished." Thomas forced himself to move, pushing through the front door into the sharp October morning. Behind him, he heard Silas calling out in a voice warm with genuine regret. "Marshal Whitmore. Should you change your mind, remember, room 17 will always be waiting for you. We've prepared it specially for men of your particular temperament." As Thomas mounted his horse, he could feel eyes watching from every window of the Vicrginia Inn. The building seemed to loom larger than before, its impossible dimensions even more pronounced in daylight. From the upstairs rooms came a chorus of sounds, crying, laughing, moaning, that followed him down the muddy track until the inn disappeared behind the dead tobacco fields. Thomas rode only far enough to reach the tree-line before doubling back on foot. He couldn't leave, not with what he'd seen in that ledger, not with the sounds of suffering echoing from the upstairs rooms. Whatever the Blackwood brothers had created in their remote and demanded investigation, regardless of the risk to his own safety. He approached the building from the rear, using the elaborate flower garden as cover. The ground floor windows stood dark, but those on the second story glowed with flickering candlelight. From his position among Mordecai's carefully tended memorial rows, Thomas could hear voices drifting down, conversations that made his blood run cold. A wooden trellis covered with dying vines provided access to the upper floor. Thomas climbed carefully, testing each handhold, until he reached a narrow window. The glass was fogged with condensation, but he could make out movement within, figures gathered around what appeared to be a bed. The window opened silently at his touch. Thomas slipped inside, finding himself in a corridor identical to the one on the ground floor but impossibly longer. The numbered doors stretched ahead and behind him, each one marked with those deep carved numerals he'd noticed the previous night. From behind the doors came sounds that defied easy categorization, weeping that might have been laughter, screaming that carried notes of ecstasy, and underneath it all, a rhythmic chanting in a language he didn't recognize. Room 12 stood halfway down the corridor, its door marked with gouges similar to those in his own chamber. Thomas pressed his ear to the wood and heard voices inside, one pleading, another responding with gentle reassurance. "Please," a man's voice begged, "I can't. I don't understand what's happening to me." "But you do understand," came Silas's smooth reply. "You've always understood, haven't you, Mr. Henderson? The part of you that craves this has been waiting your entire life. We're simply helping it emerge." Thomas tried the handle. The door opened easily, revealing a scene that would haunt his dreams for years to come. A man in his 50s lay strapped to a bed, his body bearing marks that should have caused agony but which he seemed to welcome with disturbing enthusiasm. Silas stood beside the bed, holding instruments that belonged in a surgeon's kit. "Marshal Whitmore," Silas said without turning around. "I wondered when you'd join us. Please, come in." Mr. Henderson was just experiencing a breakthrough. The man on the bed turned his head toward Thomas, and the marshal saw eyes that held a terrible mix of torment and gratitude. "He's helping me," Henderson whispered. "I thought I knew what pleasure was, but I was so wrong. So beautifully wrong. What have you done to him?" Thomas demanded, though he kept his voice low to avoid alerting others in the building. "We've removed his limitations," Silas explained, finally facing Thomas with that perpetual smile. "Mr. Henderson arrived 3 weeks ago seeking simple companionship. But we could see his true nature, the part that hungered for experiences beyond conventional morality. We've been teaching him to embrace that hunger." Henderson laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I tried to leave twice, Marshal. Made it all the way to the road. But I came back. I had to come back. Nothing in my old life could compare to what they've shown me here." Thomas moved to the door, intending to call for help, but Silas's voice stopped him. "The other rooms, Marshal. You should see the other rooms before you make any hasty decisions." Against his better judgment, Thomas found himself moving further down the corridor. Room 9 contained a woman who introduced herself as Catherine Mills, though her appearance suggested she hadn't seen sunlight in months. She sat in a rocking chair, knitting what appeared to be a burial shroud, humming contentedly to herself. "Such a lovely day," she told Thomas when he entered. "Brother Mordecai says I'll be ready for the garden soon. My own special row of flowers. Isn't that wonderful? Catherine, I'm a federal marshal. I can take you away from here." She looked at him with pity. "Away? But why would I want to leave paradise? I was so unhappy before, my husband's death, my children's coldness. But here I've learned that suffering is just love wearing a different face. Every tear I cry is actually joy. Room 5 held a family, parents and 2 young children who should have been in school but instead sat in perfect silence, their eyes vacant and peaceful. They watched Thomas enter with expressions of serene contentment, as if his presence was just another pleasant part of their day. "We're learning patience," the mother explained in a voice like a sleepwalker's. "Brother Silas says patience is the first step toward understanding. The children are so much better behaved now. They never cry anymore, never complain. We're all so very grateful." Each room revealed similar scenes, people who should have been screaming for rescue instead speaking of their experiences with religious fervor. A traveling preacher from Virginia described his nightly visions as divine revelation. A merchant from Louisville explained how losing everything he'd ever owned had taught him the true value of suffering. Children who should have been playing outside instead sat motionless, their minds clearly broken in ways that made them docile and cooperative. Thomas counted 17 occupied rooms, each containing victims in various stages of psychological destruction. The Blackwood brothers had created a grotesque parody of salvation, convincing their captives that torture was enlightenment, that madness was clarity. In the final room at the corridor's end, Thomas found Mordecai kneeling beside a bed where a young woman lay unconscious. She couldn't have been more than 16, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow. "Ah, Marshal," Mordecai greeted him without surprise. "Meet our newest arrival. Miss Rebecca Thorne, from a good family in Lexington. She'll make a wonderful addition to our community once she adjusts to our methods. She's dying. She's being reborn." Mordecai stroked the girl's hair with genuine tenderness. The old Rebecca was weak, frightened, constrained by society's ridiculous notions of propriety. "We're helping her become something beautiful, someone who understands that true pleasure requires the complete destruction of inhibition." Thomas drew his weapon, pointing it at Mordecai's chest. "I'm shutting this place down." Mordecai smiled, that same disturbing expression of genuine affection his brother wore. "With what authority, Marshal? These people are here voluntarily. They speak glowingly of their treatment. Where's your evidence of wrongdoing?" The horrible truth was that Mordecai was right. Every person Thomas had encountered would testify that they were receiving exactly what they desired. The Blackwood brothers had perfected a form of control that made their victims into willing accomplices. "Besides," Mordecai continued, rising from beside the unconscious girl, "you've seen what we can accomplish. Imagine what we could teach you, Marshal. A man in your position, carrying all that responsibility, all that guilt over the criminals you couldn't catch, the victims you couldn't save. We could show you how to transform that burden into something wonderful." Thomas backed toward the door, his gun steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You're both insane." "We're both free," Mordecai corrected. "Free from the limitations that bind ordinary people. And we offer that same freedom to everyone who finds their way to us." As Thomas fled the corridor of horrors, he could hear doors opening behind him. The victims were emerging from their rooms, not to escape, but to watch him go with expressions of pity. They genuinely believed he was walking away from salvation. Thomas burst through the inn's front door to find Silas waiting for him on the porch, rocking gently in a chair that hadn't been there that morning. The man appeared completely relaxed, as if he'd been expecting Thomas's hasty exit from the upstairs rooms. "Disturbing, isn't it?" Silas observed mildly. "Seeing people choose what you consider suffering over what you consider freedom. It challenges certain assumptions about human nature." Thomas kept his weapon drawn, though he was beginning to understand its uselessness against men who seemed genuinely unconcerned by the threat of death. "Those people are prisoners." "Those people are pilgrims," Silas corrected, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Each one came to us seeking something they couldn't name, carrying burdens they couldn't bear. We've simply shown them that their pain can become their pleasure, their shame can become their glory. Mordecai emerged from the inn's interior, his clothes still stained with soil from the morning's gardening. "He's seen the upstairs rooms, brother. I think it's time we showed him the real work." "The cellar," Silas agreed. "Marshal, you've witnessed the results of our ministry, but you haven't seen its foundation. Perhaps understanding our methods would help you appreciate our goals." Thomas found himself walking between the two brothers, his gun still drawn but feeling increasingly irrelevant. They moved around the side of the building to where wooden doors set into the ground marked the entrance to what must have been a root cellar. Silas produced an ornate key from his vest pocket, its metal black with age. "Our grandfather was a remarkable man," he explained as he worked the lock. "A surgeon by training, but his true calling lay in exploring the boundaries of human sensation. He spent years in Haiti studying with practitioners of older traditions." The doors opened to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. Candles flickered to life as they descended, though Thomas saw no one lighting them. The cellar stretched much larger than the inn above could possibly contain, its walls carved from living rock and lined with shelves holding jars, books, and instruments that belonged in no civilized place. 87 guests have achieved perfect understanding under our guidance," Mordecai said proudly, gesturing toward the shelves. "Each jar contains a memento of their transformation, a final testament to the beautiful work we accomplished together." Thomas approached the nearest shelf, his stomach churning at what the jars might contain. Labels written in the same careful script as the guest ledger marked each container: Eleanor Hayes, heart; Marcus Drum, eyes; Sarah Mitchell, tongue. The preservation liquid within the jars was crystal clear, allowing their contents to be viewed in horrifying detail. "Trophies," Thomas whispered. "Sacraments," Silas corrected. "Each person who reaches complete understanding makes a final gift to our work. They beg us to take these pieces, knowing their essence will live on to help others achieve the same transcendence." At the cellar's center stood an altar carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. Symbols covered every inch: spirals, crosses, pentagrams, and others that seemed to shift when Thomas looked directly at them. Grooves carved into the stone led to channels that disappeared into the cellar floor. "This is where the real work happens," Mordecai explained, running his hands lovingly over the stone surface. "Our grandfather's journal contained detailed instructions for rituals that blur the line between pleasure and pain, joy and suffering. Each person who lies here experiences something beyond human language to describe." Thomas noticed books scattered around the altar's base, leather-bound volumes with titles in Latin, French, and languages he couldn't identify. One lay open to an illustration that showed figures arranged around an identical altar, their faces expressing rapture while being subjected to procedures that should have killed them. "The technique requires perfect trust between practitioner and subject," Silas continued, clearly enjoying Thomas's horrified fascination. "We spend weeks, sometimes months, preparing each individual. Breaking down their resistance, teaching them to welcome what they once feared, showing them that their greatest terror can become their greatest pleasure. And then you murder them. We help them transcend," Mordecai said gently. "The final ritual doesn't end their existence, it transforms it into something pure. Their pain becomes our power, their deaths become our strength, their essence joins with something far greater than their individual selves." Silas moved to one of the bookshelves, retrieving a journal bound in what looked like human skin. "Would you like to read some testimonials, Marshal? Final letters from our guests, written just before their transformation. They're quite moving." Thomas backed toward the stairs, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed. The Blackwood brothers hadn't just created a house of horrors, they'd established a religious cult dedicated to the worship of suffering, convincing their victims that death was deliverance. "You can't leave now," Mordecai said, blocking the stairway with his body. "Not when you're so close to understanding. We've shown you the limitation of conventional morality, the beauty that lies beyond society's arbitrary boundaries. Doesn't part of you wonder what it would feel like to simply surrender? Thomas raised his weapon, but his hands were shaking now. The cellar seemed to pulse around him, the candlelight creating shadows that moved independent of their flames. The jars on the shelves caught the light, their contents seeming to float and dance in their preservation fluid. "We've been preparing room 17 especially for you," Silas added, his voice carrying that same hypnotic quality Thomas had noticed before. "A man of your background, your experience with violence and death, your intimate familiarity with human evil, imagine what you might discover about yourself in the right circumstances." "I've seen enough," Thomas managed, though the words felt thick on his tongue. The air in the cellar was becoming difficult to breathe, heavy with incense and something else, something organic and cloying that made his vision blur at the edges. "Have you?" Mordecai stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like an animal's. "Or are you just beginning to see? All those criminals you've hunted, Marshal, did you ever wonder why some people are drawn to darkness? Did you ever consider that they might be seeking something you've never allowed yourself to explore?" The black stone altar seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Thomas could hear voices whispering from the jars, pleading with him to understand, to join them in their eternal rapture. His gun felt impossibly heavy in his hands. "Room 17 is waiting," Silas whispered, and Thomas realized both brothers were now standing between him and the stairs. "Just one night, Marshal. Let us show you what lies beyond the boundaries of law and order. What could it hurt to simply see? If you discovered absolute evil masquerading as kindness, would you try to save the victims or destroy the source?" Thomas forced himself up the cellar stairs, the brothers' voices following him like smoke. His legs felt weak, his vision swimming from whatever incense had filled the underground chamber. Behind him, Silas and Mordecai climbed slowly, their footsteps echoing with supernatural patience. "There's no shame in curiosity, Marshal," Silas called out. "Every lawman wonders what drives men to cross certain lines. We can show you firsthand." Thomas burst through the cellar doors into the crisp October air, grateful for the shock of cold against his fevered skin. The inn loomed before him, its windows glowing like eyes in the gathering dusk. From the upstairs rooms came the familiar chorus of voices, crying, laughing, pleading for more of whatever the brothers provided. He couldn't leave them. Despite their apparent willingness to stay, despite their protests that they were experiencing paradise, Thomas knew the truth. The Blackwood brothers had broken these people's minds so completely that they couldn't distinguish between salvation and damnation. Moving quickly around the building's perimeter, Thomas began splashing kerosene from the inn's own lamps against the wooden walls. The structure was old, dry, and would burn quickly once ignited. He worked methodically, knowing the brothers were somewhere behind him but feeling strangely confident they wouldn't try to stop him. "Interesting solution," Mordecai observed, emerging from the cellar with his brother. "Though I'm curious, do you truly believe fire will cleanse what we've created here?" Thomas struck a match, its flame dancing in the mountain wind. "I believe it will end your reign of horror." "Will it?" Silas moved closer, his perfect smile unchanged even as flames began licking up the inn's exterior walls. "The people upstairs, do you think they'll thank you for destroying their paradise?" As if summoned by his words, faces appeared in the upper windows. The inn's victims pressed against the glass, their expressions not grateful but horrified. They began screaming, not in fear of the fire, but in anguish at losing what they'd been taught to treasure. "No." Catherine Mills's voice rose above the others. "You don't understand. We need this place. We need them." The man from room 12, Henderson, threw open his window and leaned out into the smoke. "Please, Marshal. They're helping us. You're destroying everything beautiful in the world." Thomas watched in growing horror as the victims began breaking windows, not to escape the spreading flames but to plead with him to extinguish them. These broken souls genuinely believed he was stealing their salvation, condemning them to return to lives they now found unbearable. "You see," Mordecai said gently, making no move to flee the growing inferno. "They understand what you refuse to accept. We've given them something more precious than life itself, perfect submission to their own nature." The flames reached the inn's main structure, consuming the elaborate porch and climbing toward the impossible second story. Thomas expected the brothers to run, to show some instinct for self-preservation, but they remained perfectly calm. "Grandfather's journal contains detailed instructions," Silas explained, pulling the leather-bound book from his coat. "The rituals, the techniques, the prayers necessary to continue our work. Fire can't destroy knowledge, Marshal. It can only scatter it like seeds on the wind." Mordecai nodded toward the burning building. "And our guests, their transformations are complete. Death won't end their understanding, it will only make it eternal. They'll carry their enlightenment into whatever comes next." The screaming from upstairs had changed in character. Where moments before it had been protests against Thomas's intervention, now it carried notes of genuine ecstasy. The victims were embracing the flames as another form of the beautiful suffering their captors had taught them to crave. "We won't resist," Silas announced, walking deliberately toward the burning inn. "This fire is simply another form of revelation. We've spent years teaching others to find pleasure in pain, now we'll demonstrate the principle ourselves." Thomas watched in sick fascination as both brothers entered the blazing structure. Through the ground floor windows, he could see them moving calmly through rooms engulfed in flame, their clothes beginning to smolder, their hair catching fire. They were laughing. The sound rose above the roar of the flames and the screaming from upstairs, genuine laughter, full of joy and anticipation. The Blackwood brothers had so completely embraced their own twisted philosophy that they welcomed death by fire as the ultimate spiritual experience. "The work continues." Silas's voice carried through the burning walls. 87 souls now understand the truth. They'll spread the word to others. The covenant of flesh is eternal. The inn's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber. The screaming stopped abruptly, leaving only the crackling of flames and the whisper of wind through the dead tobacco fields. Thomas stood alone among Mordecai's memorial flowers, watching the structure that had housed such elaborate evil consume itself. But even as the fire burned, he could feel something wrong in the air. The smoke carried scents that reminded him of the cellar's incense, and the way the flames danced seemed almost choreographed. The Blackwood brothers had spent years perfecting rituals that blurred the lines between different forms of experience. What if they'd found a way to transform even their own deaths into something else entirely? As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Thomas began his long ride back to civilization, carrying with him the knowledge that some evils are too profound to simply burn away. The Vicrginia Inn was gone, but the ideas it had housed, the techniques it had perfected, might survive in other forms, other places. Behind him, the memorial garden remained untouched by the flames, 87 rows of flowers growing from soil that would never again produce anything clean. Thomas sat in his office in Frankfurt 6 weeks later, staring at the official report he'd written and rewritten a dozen times. The pages before him contained a carefully sanitized version of what he'd discovered at the Vicrginia Inn, a criminal enterprise involving kidnapping, murder, and the systematic abuse of travelers. The kind of evil that fit neatly into legal categories and wouldn't challenge anyone's understanding of how the world worked. What the report didn't mention was how the inn's dimensions had defied physical laws, how the brothers had seemed genuinely unconcerned by the threat of death, or how their victims had begged to remain in captivity. It didn't describe the black stone altar that had disappeared entirely when investigators returned to sift through the ashes, leaving only a perfectly circular patch of ground where nothing would grow. The official version described Silas and Mordecai Blackwood as confidence men who'd preyed on vulnerable travelers, using drugs and psychological manipulation to control their victims before eventually murdering them. It was a reasonable explanation that satisfied his superiors and provided closure for the families of the missing. But late at night, when Thomas closed his eyes, he could still hear the brothers' final words echoing through the burning inn, "The covenant of flesh is eternal." He'd researched everything he could find about their grandfather, discovering fragments of a man who traveled extensively through the Caribbean before settling in Kentucky. Medical journals from the 1790s contained brief mentions of Dr. Ezekiel Blackwood's unconventional theories about pain management and psychological treatment, but nothing that explained the rituals his grandsons had perfected. Thomas included a recommendation in his report that the Vicrginia Inn property be permanently sealed and never sold. The Commonwealth of Kentucky agreed, declaring the land unsuitable for development due to geological instabilities that made construction dangerous. The memorial garden was plowed under, though workers reported that the soil beneath the flowers was black as charcoal and smelled of things that had been dead too long. 3 months after filing his report, Thomas received word that Sheriff Morrison of Harlan County had died in his sleep, apparently from natural causes. The man's final diary entry, discovered by his deputy, contained rambling passages about beautiful dreams and his gratitude for lessons learned in sacred places. Thomas remembered Morrison's name from the inn's guest ledger and wondered what other authorities might have been touched by the Blackwood brothers' influence. Other incidents began reaching his desk, reports of missing persons near remote inns throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, establishments run by soft-spoken proprietors who seemed unusually interested in their guests' psychological well-being. Each investigation led nowhere, the alleged victims found to be willing participants in what appeared to be spiritual retreats. But Thomas noticed patterns in the reports that reminded him of the Vicrginia Inn. Guests who stayed longer than intended, families who changed their travel plans without explanation, children who became unnaturally quiet and obedient. The techniques the Blackwood brothers had perfected were spreading, carried by survivors who'd learned to find pleasure in their own suffering. The worst incident occurred 9 months after the inn's destruction. Thomas traveled to a remote boarding house in the Tennessee mountains where 3 families had reportedly vanished. He found them in rooms above the main establishment, all alive and apparently healthy, all speaking in the same dreamy monotone he'd heard from Catherine Mills and the others. "We're learning patience," a mother told him, her young children sitting motionless beside her. "Brother Isaiah says patience is the first step toward understanding." The proprietor, a man who called himself Isaiah Cornwall but whose techniques exactly matched those Thomas had witnessed in Kentucky, greeted the marshal with polite interest. "Have you come seeking enlightenment as well? We have rooms available for distinguished guests." Thomas left without making arrests, knowing that any charges would be dropped when the supposed victims testified about their wonderful treatment. But he took careful note of the man's appearance, his methods, his words. Someone was carrying on the Blackwood brothers' work, spreading their philosophy like a disease through the isolated mountain communities. In his final report, filed just before requesting a transfer to a different jurisdiction, Thomas documented his growing certainty that the Vicrginia Inn had been only one branch of a larger organization. The Blackwood brothers had mentioned their grandfather's journals, techniques learned from older traditions, and methods refined over generations. Their death hadn't ended the covenant they'd served, it had simply passed the responsibility to others. Thomas closed his last Kentucky case file and packed his belongings, accepting a position with the territorial government in Oregon. But even as his train carried him west, away from the mountains where such horrors flourished, he knew the work would continue. Somewhere in the backwoods, soft-spoken proprietors were welcoming weary travelers, offering them rest and comfort and something far more dangerous. The Vicrginia Inn was gone, but its legacy lived on in the minds of those who'd learned its lessons. 87 souls had achieved what the brothers called perfect understanding, and their understanding was spreading like ripples in a dark pond. If this story stayed with you, comment, the 87 remember everything.